In 1989, 5 teenagers confessed to a crime they didn't commit. The Central Park 5 case would become one of the most notorious examples of false confession in American legal history. 4 of the 5 gave detailed, videotaped confessions. They described how they attacked a jogger in Central Park. They included specifics about the crime scene, the assault, the location. Every single detail was wrong. 13 years later, DNA evidence and a confession from the actual perpetrator proved their innocence. But here's the disturbing part. Those teenagers weren't outliers. They weren't weak-minded or uniquely vulnerable. The psychological mechanisms that produce their confessions operate in all of us, under the right conditions. And researchers have spent decades figuring out exactly how to trigger them. Let's start with what most people get wrong about false confessions. The assumption is that innocent people don't confess, that you'd have to be coerced, tortured, or mentally impaired to admit to something you didn't do. The data tells a very different story. According to the National Registry of Exonerations, false confessions have contributed to approximately 29% of wrongful convictions that were later overturned by DNA evidence. In murder cases specifically, that number jumps to 63%. These aren't rare anomalies. These are systemic patterns. And the psychology behind them has been studied, replicated, and refined in laboratory settings for over 40 years. The foundational research began in the 1970s with psychologist Saul Kassin at Williams College. Kassin wasn't studying confessions initially. He was investigating decision-making under pressure. But what he discovered would reshape how we understand interrogation entirely. In one early experiment, Kassin had participants work on a computer task. They were explicitly told not to press the Alt key because it would crash the system and destroy data. Midway through the task, the computer crashed. The researcher accused the participant of hitting the forbidden key. They hadn't. The crash was programmed to happen regardless. Here's what happened next. When simply accused, about 48% of participants signed a confession admitting they hit the key. When a Confederate, another fake participant, claimed they saw them hit the key, that number jumped to 94%. But the truly disturbing finding came in the follow-up interviews. After signing false confessions, many participants began to internalize the false memory. They convinced themselves they actually had hit the key. Some even confabulated details about how it happened. "I think my hand slipped," they'd say. "I was typing fast and must have hit it by accident." This is where the psychology gets genuinely unsettling. Kassin identified what he called compliance versus internalization. Compliance is when you confess just to end the interrogation, knowing you're innocent. Internalization is when you actually come to believe you committed the crime. Both can be engineered. The primary method taught in American law enforcement is the Reid technique, developed in the 1950s by polygraph expert John Reid. It's been taught to hundreds of thousands of officers, and it's built on 9 steps of psychological manipulation designed to break down resistance and extract confession. Here's how it works. Step 1 is confrontation. The interrogator directly accuses the suspect and states with absolute certainty that they're guilty. Not "we think" or "evidence suggests," absolute certainty. "We know you did this." Step 2 is theme development. The interrogator offers moral justification for the crime. Anyone would have done the same thing in your situation. You were provoked. You were scared. You didn't mean for it to happen. This creates a psychological off-ramp, a way to confess without admitting to being a monster. Step 3 is handling denials. When the suspect says, "I didn't do it," the interrogator interrupts them, cuts them off, doesn't let them complete the denial. The message is clear. Your denial is irrelevant. We already know the truth. Steps 4 through 6 involve overcoming objections, keeping the suspect's attention, and handling passive mood. Basically, don't let them shut down. Keep them engaged, keep them talking. Exhaust them psychologically. By step 7, the interrogator presents an alternative question. Did you plan this for weeks, or did it just happen in the moment? Notice what's happening here. Both options assume guilt. The suspect isn't choosing whether they did it, they're choosing which version of guilty they are. Step 8 is getting the suspect to orally relate details of the offense, and Step 9 is converting that oral confession into a written or recorded statement. The entire process is designed to manipulate perception, memory, and decision-making. And it works, even on innocent people, especially on innocent people under the right conditions. Let's talk about those conditions. Sleep deprivation is one of the most powerful. After 24 hours without sleep, cognitive function deteriorates to levels comparable to legal intoxication. After 48 hours, you start experiencing microsleeps, brief moments where your brain essentially shuts off, even while you're sitting upright. Research by psychologist Kimberly Fenn at Michigan State University found that sleep-deprived participants were significantly more susceptible to false memory formation. In her experiments, sleep-deprived subjects were 4.5 times more likely to sign false confessions than well-rested subjects. But here's what makes this particularly disturbing. There's no legal limit on interrogation length in most U.S. jurisdictions. Interrogations lasting 12, 16, even 24 hours are documented and legal. The average interrogation in cases that later resulted in proven false confession lasted over 16 hours. Combine sleep deprivation with isolation, and the effects compound. Humans are social animals. Prolonged isolation triggers genuine psychological distress. After just a few hours alone in a small room, anxiety spikes. After several hours, some people begin experiencing dissociative symptoms. The interrogation room itself is weaponized. Small, usually 8 by 10 feet, no windows, soundproofed. A metal table bolted to the floor, uncomfortable chairs, harsh overhead lighting. The environment communicates powerlessness. Now add what psychologists call minimization and maximization techniques. Minimization is when the interrogator downplays the seriousness of the offense. This isn't that big a deal. People make mistakes. If you just explain what happened, we can help you. Maximization is the opposite. We have forensic evidence. We have witnesses. We have everything we need. If you don't cooperate, you're looking at the maximum sentence. But if you help us out, we can talk to the prosecutor. Both are lies. Police are legally allowed to lie during interrogations in the United States. They can fabricate evidence, invent witnesses, claim they have forensic results that don't exist, and suspects have no way to verify these claims. Let's talk about the polygraph because it plays a fascinating psychological role. The polygraph doesn't detect lies. That's been scientifically established for decades. What it does is measure physiological arousal, heart rate, blood pressure, respiration, skin conductivity. Anxiety makes these spike. So does anger, fear, surprise, or just being asked accusatory questions while strapped to a machine. But interrogators use it as a prop. You failed the polygraph. The machine says you're lying. The science proves it. For many people, especially younger suspects or those who trust authority, this is devastating. The machine becomes an infallible witness against them. Which brings us to juveniles. Teenagers and children are catastrophically vulnerable to false confession. According to research by Stephen Drizin at Northwestern University, suspects under 18 make up about 8% of arrests, but account for over 30% of proven false confessions. The reason is neurological. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for impulse control, long-term planning, and resisting social pressure, doesn't fully develop until the mid-20s. Teenagers are literally less equipped to withstand interrogation than adults. They're also more susceptible to authority figures, more likely to believe that cooperation will lead to leniency, and less likely to understand their legal rights, even when Miranda warnings are read. The Supreme Court acknowledged this in JDB v. North Carolina in 2011, ruling that age matters in determining custody for Miranda purposes. But that doesn't stop interrogations of minors without parents or attorneys present. It just adds a procedural checkbox. Let me give you a specific case. In 1998, 14-year-old Michael Crow was interrogated for hours about the murder of his 12-year-old sister Stephanie. He was sleep-deprived, isolated, and subjected to classic Reid technique manipulation. Interrogators told him he failed a polygraph. They told him his hair was found on the victim. They suggested he had repressed memories of the killing. After hours of this, Michael confessed. He described stabbing his sister. He provided details. But here's the problem. Forensic evidence proved he couldn't have done it. His hair was never found on the victim. The polygraph results were meaningless. And eventually, a drifter with the victim's blood on his clothing was arrested and convicted. Michael Crow's confession was ruled inadmissible. But it had already been given, already been recorded, already shaped the investigation. The contamination of confession is another crucial element. When someone confesses, they're often asked to provide details that only the perpetrator would know. But in many documented false confessions, those details were fed to the suspect during interrogation. Psychologist Melissa Rusano at Roger Williams University conducted experiments on this. She found that when interrogators inadvertently or deliberately disclosed crime scene information, suspects incorporated those details into false confessions at alarming rates. The suspect hears the victim was stabbed 7 times, or the weapon was found in the garage during questioning. Later, when they confess under psychological duress, they repeat those details, and investigators take that as confirmation of guilt. But it's circular. The information came from the investigators themselves. Elizabeth Loftus, the pioneering researcher on false memories, has demonstrated how easily memories can be implanted, altered, or constructed wholesale. In her famous Lost in the Mall experiments, she convinced participants they had experienced childhood events that never happened, simply through suggestion and repeated questioning. Now imagine that same malleability applied in a high-stress interrogation. You're exhausted, isolated, psychologically battered. Authority figures are telling you with absolute certainty that you committed a crime. They're offering you explanations for how it could have happened. They're providing details you don't remember. Your brain starts trying to make sense of the disconnect. If they're this certain, if they have all this evidence, maybe I did do it. Maybe I don't remember. Maybe I blocked it out. The human mind abhors uncertainty. We create narratives to explain things. Sometimes, we create false narratives. People with intellectual disabilities face even more severe vulnerability. Research by Professor Alison Redlich found that individuals with intellectual disabilities are significantly more likely to comply with authority, struggle to understand legal rights, and provide false confessions. In the case of Earl Washington Jr., a man with an IQ of 69 confessed to a rape and murder he didn't commit. He was sentenced to death. He came within 9 days of execution before DNA evidence proved his innocence after 17 years in prison. His confession was filled with inaccuracies and had to be corrected repeatedly by interrogators. But because he eventually signed a statement, it was used against him. The pattern repeats across demographics. Mental illness increases vulnerability. Language barriers increase vulnerability. Low socioeconomic status correlates with less access to legal representation and less understanding of rights. The system disproportionately extracts false confessions from the most vulnerable. And here's something that should disturb you. Even when people know about these techniques, even when they're educated about false confession psychology, it doesn't necessarily protect them. Because the techniques don't rely on ignorance. They rely on fundamental aspects of human psychology that operate below conscious awareness. When you're under severe stress, your prefrontal cortex, the rational decision-making part of your brain, literally goes offline. The amygdala takes over. You're operating on emotion and survival instinct. The decision to confess in that moment feels like the only way to make the pain stop, and the consequences are permanent. A confession, even a false one, is extraordinarily difficult to overcome at trial. Juries find confessions compelling. Even when defense attorneys explain the psychology, even when they show the coercive techniques, the gut reaction is, why would someone confess to something they didn't do? So what's being done about this? Some jurisdictions have implemented reforms. Mandatory recording of interrogations from start to finish. Restrictions on interrogation length. Requirements for attorneys to be present during juvenile interrogations. In 2021, New York State passed legislation requiring that interrogations of all suspects, not just those accused of certain crimes, be recorded. Illinois made similar reforms. But these are still the exception, not the rule. The PEACE model, developed in the United Kingdom, offers an alternative approach. PEACE stands for Preparation and Planning, Engage and Explain, Account, Closure, and Evaluate. It's a non-confrontational method focused on information gathering rather than confession extraction. Research comparing the Reid technique to PEACE shows that PEACE produces fewer false confessions while maintaining or improving accurate confession rates. But adoption in the United States has been limited. The culture of American law enforcement remains oriented toward confrontation. Then there's the question of expertise. In many false confession cases that reach trial, defense attorneys attempt to introduce expert testimony on confession psychology. But courts are inconsistent about allowing it. Some judges permit it. Others rule it's not sufficiently established science, or that it invades the jury's role. This is absurd. The science of false confession is as well established as any forensic discipline. We have decades of peer-reviewed research, replicable experiments, and documented cases. But legal standards lag behind scientific consensus. Meanwhile, the Innocence Project and similar organizations continue to document cases. As of 2024, there have been over 375 DNA exonerations in the United States. False confessions played a role in approximately 29% of them. That's more than 100 people who confessed to crimes they didn't commit and were later proven innocent by objective scientific evidence. And those are just the cases where DNA was available. How many more false confessions led to convictions in cases without biological evidence? Cases where innocence can never be definitively proven. The International Association of Chiefs of Police updated their interrogation guidelines in 2012, acknowledging false confession risks. But guidelines aren't law, they're suggestions. And old habits, especially in high-pressure departments with limited resources and pressure to close cases, persist. Think about what this means. The psychological mechanisms that produce false confessions are universal. They exist in you, in me, in everyone. Under the right conditions of stress, exhaustion, isolation, and manipulation, people will confess to things they didn't do. Not because they're weak, because they're human. The system knows this. The research is public. The techniques are documented. And yet, the machinery continues operating largely unchanged. When the Central Park Five were exonerated, the city of New York eventually settled with them for $41 million. Michael Crow and his family received a settlement. Earl Washington Jr. received compensation for his wrongful conviction. Money doesn't return years lost.
It doesn't undo psychological trauma. It doesn't restore reputation. But it's the system's only language for accountability. The broader accountability, the systemic change, remains incomplete. False confessions continue. Coercive interrogations continue. Vulnerable populations continue to be disproportionately victimized. Some reform is happening. Some jurisdictions are changing. But it's piecemeal, inconsistent, and fought against by law enforcement lobbying groups who argue that restrictions on interrogation will hamper investigations. The question isn't whether false confessions happen. We know they do. The question is how we weight competing interests, the desire to solve crimes versus the imperative to avoid convicting the innocent, efficiency versus accuracy, results versus rights. And here's the uncomfortable truth. False confessions aren't bugs in the system. They're features. Not intentional, perhaps, but inevitable products of techniques designed to maximize confessions rather than maximize truth. So the next time you hear about a confession, ask questions. How long was the interrogation? Was it recorded from the beginning? Was a lawyer present? What was the suspect's mental state? Their age? Their IQ? Because confession, that supposedly most reliable form of evidence, is more fragile and more constructed than most people realize. The psychology that creates false confessions operates in all of us. The only difference is whether we're ever subjected to the conditions that activate it. If this video made you think differently about confession evidence, leave a comment below. And if you want to see more investigations into the psychology behind criminal justice, hit subscribe.